Last week we were deep in the throes of the apocalypse, trying to discern what is going to happen in the end. The earliest Christians believed two things very strongly. Number one, that Jesus Christ was going to return to the earth, and number two, that when he returned, he was going to judge all people. Now, you may have noticed that as we've read the Gospel of Matthew, there is a lot of talk about judgment. And in fact, today, the three parables we're going to look at all have to do with judgment, all have to do with what we can expect in the judgment or how to prepare for the judgment. In fact, these three parables, which are found in Matthew chapter 25, are really to be considered a continuation of chapter 24, or a commentary by Jesus on what we can expect in the end. Come and join me today on the way. I think I'm exaggerating to say that the three parables found in Matthew 25 are among the best known and the most beloved parables in all the Gospels. We have the parable of the talents, the one in which preachers have for centuries used to warn us against burying what we have in the ground. We have the parable of the bridesmaids and the oil, which, while not as popular, is intriguing in its own right. And we have my personal favorite, the parable of the sheep and the goats, from which we get those iconic words of Jesus. When you did it to the least of these, the hungry, the sick, the poor, you did it unto me. However, each one of these parables also has a long history of being misinterpreted or misunderstood. Right now I want to focus on the parable of the talents. It should be noted that the word talent is a form of money, an extremely large amount of money. One talent was roughly worth 20 years of wages for a laborer. So you can see that 10 talents is an exceedingly large amount. Now, the word talent to mean God-given abilities, that came into being in the Middle Ages in the English language, precisely because of the popularity of this story. But in the story itself, in the parable, it is about money. Often this is used as a text for stewardship sermons, and preachers urge us not to bury our God-given abilities or our God-given resources, and not to let them go to waste. We tend to see the laziness of the third servant as the point of the parable. But Dr. Wes Allen is going to help us see this parable from a different perspective and try to explain to us how he thinks Jesus is trying to make a completely different point.
You know, preachers often use the parable of the talents as a stewardship.
Yes.
Right? But remember, the master is unjust. And that's never changed. It's never overturned in the expectation of the reader. So anybody tries to draw an analogy of the master is God and the other, well, you just got problems, because God looks really bad if you use that allegorical reading. But it's really about that third one who just buries the money and doesn't do anything. And this is where you got to hear all these parables as eschatological. In the eschatological experience, those who are given, who take their responsibility and use it, will be given more. The slaves never own that money. It's someone else's. It's the master. So the one who gets 10 and then gets 10 more to use, this exorbitant amount of money. The same with 5, and the one with 1 who is taken out into weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's all about, if you are serving the community, serving God, the reign of God appropriately, you will be given more to do. It's not you can now rest and play your harp on a cloud.
You have more responsibility.
Yeah.
Right.
You're trustworthy in this, you'll be trustworthy in more. I think Matthew, at the very least, doesn't expect Jesus to return right away anymore. I think he's trying to hold on to that very important central language and reinterpret it. So I think it's being interpreted in terms of righteousness, politically, in terms of the reign of God. So how do you live in between the already and not yet? And those who live faithfully will be given more and more leadership and responsibility in that liminal time. I actually think the parable is misread. I think it is not about judgment of the Christian communities. It's about judgment of those outside the Christian community based on how they treat Christian community. Because there's the language of the least of these of my brothers, and so notice it says the Gentiles will be gathered, which means nations. So all the nations, it usually means, though, nations other than Israel. Gentiles, though, in the Gospels can either mean non-Jewish or it can sometimes mean non-Christian. Its context makes a difference. And so I think in this place, it's saying just because they're not Christian doesn't mean they can't be in the sheepfold. It's whether or not they fed the hungry, whether they've clothed the naked, visited the sick. So if the least, the persecuted Christians are treated well by those, they are just as saved, to use our contemporary language, as would be those in Christian community.
I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that all three parables have to do with judgment. The third and final parable, having to do with the sheep and goats, explicitly takes place in a judgment setting. The sheep and the goats come before the final judge, and then they are told to go to either heaven or to hell. And that's how many of us commonly think of judgment. We think of it as something that takes place after we die, and we appear before a judge, and that judge reviews all the past actions of our life and then decides and tells us where we should go, whether to heaven or to hell. But I don't think that's how judgment actually works. I believe that judgment is something that is ongoing. We all live constantly under judgment. Everything we do has consequences, and we're always living out those consequences. It's not that we should be afraid of judgment after we die. We instead should constantly be aware that we are living under judgment in the here and now. If Matthew is trying to tell us anything, it is that we are people who should live out the values of the kingdom of God all the time, day in and day out. I'll see you next time on The Way.